The year is 1899. You're sitting around a campfire after a long day of logging. The sweat has finally dried off your brow, and the smell of smoke and beans fills the air. You've only been on the job for a few weeks, having moved to northern Wisconsin to escape the city life that had become too busy to bear. Lost in your own thoughts, you don't even notice when someone new joins the circle sitting around your fire. The sound of a match striking pulls you into the moment, and you look up to see the man lighting a cigarette, tossing the used match into the fire as he looks over at you. "So, you're the new kid, eh?" "Yeah." "A kid from New York?" You nod and look back at the fire. "Hopefully you'll last longer than the last greenhorn we had. I could smell his mama's milk pouring off him. Just try not to get yourself killed and keep an eye out for the Hodag." You perk up. Hodag? A terrible beast. Long, sharp claws like a lion, horns like a bull. Its tail's enough to make the ground quake, and it loves fresh meat. It's got spikes all up and down its back, and it'd just as soon kill you as look at you. Just don't wander off alone in the dark in these parts. That's how the story of the Hodag started. A tale told round the campfire at logging camps in the 19th century. But if not for one man in the 1890s, it might have stayed as nothing more than a tale, lost to time and forgotten by all but a few. Welcome to Season 2 of The Long Way Home. I'm your host, Josh Bearheart Hawk, and as we start a new year, I've got some amazing things coming your way. If you've been listening for a while, you might notice there's a new format for this season, and I'm a little more organized. My goal for this year is to give you something to listen to on those dark, lonely nights as you travel down dirt roads in the middle of nowhere or work your way along a desolate freeway. The destination isn't really important, it's all about the journey, and the journey is made so much better when you take the long way home. We all love a good legend. Some of the best memories I have of my childhood involve sitting around a fire, or maybe in the living room by the light of a candle, as some relative or friend recounted the story of a ghost or a monster that supposedly stalked some small town in rural Ohio. My mom used to live by the Haunted Ohio book series that Chris Woodyard wrote, using the stories of hauntings to find places to take us on moonlit nights. We'd pile into the Chevy Astrovan alongside one of her friends and their kids and head off in search of ghosts and demons. But my favorite stories always revolved around monsters. Bigfoot was a personal favorite. The thought of some large ape-like man walking around the woods and messing with campers was intriguing. I think it was more about the idea that a creature like that would be real, tangible. It wasn't like ghosts that only showed up in pictures, it was something that I could potentially run into. As I grew older, I found myself constantly on the lookout for new cryptids to learn about. Whether it was the Loch Ness Monster, Mothman, or Ohio's own version of Bigfoot, the Grassman, I was hooked on finding these mysterious creatures. Then, as the internet age entered its heyday, some of the legendary creatures I'd sought became a little less real. Questions about the famous Bigfoot video, the Patterson-Gimlin film, were raised, and the possibility of the footage being a hoax went mainstream. Faked footprints came out of the woodwork, and Bigfoot wasn't quite so big in my mind. Then there was the Loch Ness Monster picture, the one where you could clearly see the head of some animal popping out of the loch in black and white. That turned out to be nothing more than a fraud as well. As sites like YouTube picked up steam, more and more hoaxes took hold. Not only were people finding out about hoaxes from decades prior, they were also actively creating them in the modern day. You couldn't trust anything you saw online, and before long, my hope for any of these amazing monsters being real died. But hoaxes are nothing new. People have been lying about things like monsters and ghosts for centuries, mostly for fame or notoriety, but also aiming for a laugh or two at the expense of their friends or family. And that is where Eugene Shepard comes in. Eugene was a land surveyor in the 1800s, making his living helping logging companies to determine what logs they could use on a parcel of land and what was nothing more than waste. He was intimately familiar with lumberjacks and their stories, having spent a considerable amount of time in the camps, and he was also a well known prankster. It was 1893 when Eugene gathered a group of men together and hatched a plan. The story of the Hodag was well known to many of them at the time, though it was really only shared by lumberjacks, and Eugene thought he could have some fun with it. He was apparently somewhat skilled in the art of taxidermy, at least skilled enough to put together a decent facsimile of what the Hodag might look like using a log and some parts from a few different animals. Gathering some men around his creation, he had several photographs taken as if they had just finished a hunt, with some kind of rather strange creature at the center of the group. The creature was posed on a log, and the men were standing around it with pitchforks and guns pointed as if they were preparing to finish it off. One of the men is laying down at the feet of the beast as though he'd been slain in the attempt. By modern standards, the photo looks rather goofy, but it was enough to capture the attention of newspapers. The story spread like wildfire, with Mr. Shepard telling anyone who would listen of the brave and daring mission to take down the monster that had been stalking the woods of Wisconsin. There was even a rumor of dynamite being needed to finish the thing off. As much fun as the prank was, the hype eventually died down and things went more or less back to normal for everyone. They'd all had their fun, gotten a few laughs, and made the papers, but Eugene wasn't done. 3 years later, in 1896, he would once again grab headlines, this time nationwide, when he reported that he'd caught a Hodag alive. The beast was supposedly locked in the shed near his house, caged and secured. He was even offering the public a chance to glimpse the creature, for a fee, of course. People came from far and wide, and he told them all how he'd tracked the Hodag to its den, sealing it behind some large rocks before going for the help of another group of men. When they had enough help, they doused a sponge in chloroform, attaching it to the end of a pole, and easing the pole into a small opening in the den until it was close enough for the fumes to knock the creature unconscious. Removing the rocks, the men loaded the Hodag into a wagon and brought it to Eugene's shed, where it was locked away. After telling the captivated crowd this story, he would then lead them back and give each person a chance to peer through a hole in the wall and see the monster. The thing would even move about and make noises, seemingly agitated when the crowd grew too loud. As the news traveled around the country, it caught the eye of several in the scientific community and other interested parties who began asking for a closer look. These individuals could only be held at bay for so long, and eventually Eugene had to come clean and admit he'd hoaxed the whole thing. In reality, he created another facsimile and enlisted his sons to help make the thing move and add some noises of their own to the mix. While some people were understandably upset at being lied to, the town of Rhinelander, Wisconsin, where Eugene lived, saw the publicity stunt as an opportunity. Over the next few decades, the town would embrace the legend and the hoax, building it into their own town story and eventually erecting a statue of the Hodag in front of their town's visitor center. For Eugene's part, he would spend the next couple of decades continuing his land surveys and opening a resort in Rhineland before passing away in 1923. It's kind of funny when you think about how a hoax could be the basis for a booming tourism industry, but that's exactly what the Hodag is. The legend itself was around before Eugene Shepard, but it was kind of a local thing and limited mostly to loggers as one of the many stories they would tell. The legend tied to the story of Paul Bunyan in a way, focusing on the ox. One version involves the ox wandering away from camp, and another tells of what happens when an ox dies. From The Republican, a newspaper based in Wauseon, Ohio, the best story I found on the origins of the Hodag was written in the November 15th, 1829 edition. Quote, "Once upon a time there was an ox which had led an unusually hard life at the hands of his various drivers up in the north woods of Wisconsin. Among lumberjacks, it is believed that the hide of an ox is invulnerable to everything but the profanity of its drivers. When the animal dies, its customary burial ceremony is cremation, and it requires 7 years of continuous fire to reduce to ashes all the profanity which had accumulated in its body during its lifetime. So when this particular ox died, a brush fire was built around its body and kept going for 7 years to obliterate all of the curses which had been heaped upon it in English, French, Irish, Scandinavian, and German while it had toiled away in the lumber camps. At the end of the 7th year, the fire was allowed to die down, but instead of there being no trace left of the ox, out of the heap of ashes there rose phoenix-like a fearsome creature, such as pictured above, and they put a picture in the newspaper of it, which exhaled an obnoxious odor, and the swish of whose tail made the earth tremble." End quote. Now, that beast wouldn't be one that you would want to run into in the middle of the woods, day or night. My guess is that the tail itself was probably more of a warning about the treatment of animals around the camp and treating them with respect. Oxen, later on horses, carried a lot of the load in lumber camps, and they needed to be treated right because replacing them was difficult, and no man wanted to have to pull the logs and equipment around on his own. Well, no man except Paul Bunyan. I mentioned him a minute ago, and while he's only loosely tied to the story of the Hodag, he was an idol among lumberjacks. There's not really any proof that he actually existed as a real person, though it wouldn't be completely out of the realm of possibility that a large man could have been the basis for the legend. So, a lot of you out there probably envision something like a giant when you hear the name of Paul Bunyan, but in actuality, he was reported to have been closer to about 8 feet tall and 300 pounds. While that may be well above average, especially for the mid 19th century, the tallest man ever recorded was 8 foot 11 inches tall, and someone being over 7 feet tall isn't really unheard of. But the fun of Paul Bunyan was in the tales of him and his lumber camp. It was said that he ruled with an iron fist over as many as 3,000 men at his largest camp. They said his yell broke the branches off trees, and he was apparently a heavy smoker, smoking a bushel of tobacco at a time out of a giant pipe. My favorite tale that I found of his camp involved running out of beans. It was in the middle of winter, and the camp was dealing with the biggest snowfall anyone had ever seen. The camp cook decided to brave the cold weather and deep snow alongside a giant blue ox, presumably the same blue ox that was known as Paul Bunyan's sidekick, Babe. And he made his way to the nearest town to get more beans to feed the men. So the trip to this town was over 100 miles one way, and they had to cross a frozen river and a frozen lake, both going there and coming back. It was on the trip back when the trouble set in, with the spring thaw apparently happening in a matter of hours, with the temperature going from well below freezing to nearly 100 degrees. That dramatic change would have been bad enough, but the cook and the ox just happened to be in the middle of the lake when it thawed, and they both plunged below the surface. Thankfully for the cook, the ox was large enough that he could stand on its head. It actually says that he stood on one of its horns and keep himself just above the water. He'd be stranded there until at least nightfall when Paul Bunyan would show up and save him. Now, you'd think that that would be the end of the story, but old Paul wasn't thrilled at the loss of what was supposed to be the camp's main source of food. The loggers, unsurprisingly, refused to work without something to eat, and Paul needed a plan before things got too out of hand. Thinking quick, he and his men dammed up the little river that flowed out of the lake, and then they built campfires all around the now thawed body of water. Might have seemed pointless, but apparently that was enough to get the lake boiling and cook the beans along with the remains of Babe. For the rest of the summer, the cook would feed the men hot soup from the lake, and the camp was saved for another year. Part of me feels like some of the 19th century lumberjacks might have been decent authors had they been born in a different time or place. So, we've talked about the Hodag and jumped into the legend of Paul Bunyan. That's the kind of stuff that you can expect with season 2 of The Long Way Home. I've got a ton of legends and tales to dive into, as well as some other just kind of random stuff that will come as we move along the road. I hope you'll stick around for future trips. Like I said at the beginning, my goal for this season is to focus on stories and the kinds of things that I'd like to hear when out driving late at night, or even as something to listen to while cooking, cleaning, playing games. I think the world's been spinning a lot faster than it used to in recent years, and taking some time to slow down and just share some really cool stories is what we all need a little bit more of. So make sure that you're following me on whatever platform you might be listening on so that you don't miss any new episodes as they drop. And you can check out my books over on Amazon or at joshbearhartlegendsandtales.com. I want to thank you all for listening, and I'll see you on the next road trip.